So, as you may have noticed, I read a lot of history books and I like to put up reviews of them, either talking about the work as a scholarly piece or talking about kind of the story, the major players, what the long term impacts were, that sort of thing. And I like to pick events that happened which are known, but the details aren't really known. So, like, people have heard of the 30 Years' War, the Taiping Rebellion, or the Great Siege of Malta, but they probably don't know what actually happened during it. So, I like to do a video kind of summarizing it and talking about it. And a time period I've really wanted to read about is the Anarchy, which was an 18-year-long civil war in Norman England over who would succeed Henry I, with the Empress Matilda on one side and Stephen of Blois on the other. Now, before we get into the book and my thoughts of it, maybe just a very brief summary of what the Anarchy was about. So, Norman England consisted of England proper and the Duchy of Normandy, and would eventually come to include Maine and Anjou, and over the course of the Anarchy, Aquitaine. I believe the Angevin Empire, as it came to be known, had most of its population on the continent, but the Norman kings and the Plantagenet successors had a much firmer hold over England. The Kingdom of England at this point, at least Norman England, doesn't include Wales, it doesn't include Scotland, and it doesn't include Ireland. So William the Conqueror had died, and there was a succession crisis, and a bunch of his sons killed each other, and eventually Henry I came out as the winner of the conflict. And over the course of his life, all of his sons died off, and his youngest remaining child was the Empress Matilda. And he wanted to continue the dynasty, so the decision he made was that he was going to make Matilda his heir. So he designated her his heir, and he got all the magnates of England, Normandy, to swear allegiance to Matilda and to acknowledge her as the legitimate heir to the Anglo Norman kingdom, including Stephen of Blois. However, when Henry I died, Stephen immediately snaked on Matilda, carried out a coup, got himself declared king of Anglo Normandy, and started the anarchy. And it would just be an 18-year long slugfest where neither side could really gain the advantage for any amount of time. Now, Stephen's claim made absolutely no sense. It was that he was the maternal grandson of William the Conqueror. So his claim wasn't even based on the idea that a woman couldn't inherit, because he had inherited his claim through the female line. So the argument that he wound up making was that Matilda's father and mother hadn't been legitimately married because Matilda's mother, who was also named Matilda, was actually a nun, which she wasn't. She had just been sent to a convent to be educated, which was very common. But he made the case that she was illegitimate, and so he should inherit the throne. And this really didn't make sense to anybody at the time either. But Stephen was a really nice guy and he was very generous. So, roughly about half of the lords sided with Stephen, and about half of them sided with Matilda. Although there's a bunch of them who went back and forth, and a bunch of them who were neutral and just kind of pursued their own independent squabbles. And that brings us to this book, Matilda, Empress, Queen, Warrior, which the warrior part is kind of cringy, but this book had extremely good reviews, both on Amazon and on Audible. So I figured I might as well pick it up. I had some free credits on Audible. Let's see how it goes. And given the number of history books I've read over the years, to write the worst history book I've read is quite an accomplishment. And I think what makes it bad than a lot of kind of more pop histories is it is actually fairly well researched. The author does make use of multiple sources from the time period and does continuously reference them throughout the book. So it's clear they did a lot of research, but they just ignore all the research. And it's a very strange book. So maybe let's just start out at the beginning. So this book is written from an extreme feminist perspective. in that the entire book is about how hard done by Matilda was, how helpless she was, how she couldn't accomplish any of her goals, how hard her life was because she was born a woman during the medieval period, which completely undermines the entire premise of the book. The title sounds like it's presenting this strong woman who overcame her gender and was beloved by all and was recognized as one of the greats. But the actual book is basically just one big whiny love letter about how horrible Matilda's life was. We really don't learn much about her personally. Like I said, it's just basically whenever we hear about Matilda, it's a poor me. Can you imagine how sad she was during this time period? So let's maybe take a step back and let's look at how the narrative plays out. So Matilda was married to Henry, Holy Roman Emperor. I believe she was 12 at the time or 13 when the marriage was consummated. And I will agree with them, that's pretty messed up and was probably physically dangerous. And they were just like, it's so hard. She had to go and marry this older male who was the emperor. And then she became the empress of probably the most powerful kingdom in Europe at the time. And it was really rough, guys. It was really rough. And like an early part of this is so Emperor Henry had left her as regent of northern Italy while he was governing things in Germany proper. And the book, rather than saying, oh, this is Matilda's opportunity to shine, she's been given all of this power, all of this authority, it goes, she had no power. Okay, she had power, but she was wielding it on behalf of her husband. She wasn't the sovereign empress in her own right of Italy and of the German Empire. No, she was just a simple regent. Okay, sure, she had basically absolute control over Italy and ran it as a personal kingdom during her time as regent there. But theoretically, she held it in fiefdom to her husband, so therefore it doesn't count for anything. And that was pretty much the entire summary of her time ruling northern Italy, which I'm actually kind of curious about how this young woman takes on this big task. And I would kind of be interested about any figure, male or female, being kind of thrust into this really important role without the experience. But it doesn't really talk about that. It goes in like detail about how she signed everything. Empress Matilda, wife of Emperor Henry, and they had to mention him in it. And then there was that part. And then they talked a bit more about the marriage. But basically, the whole thing was just about how horrible it was for her to be married to Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, and how she was like a pet in this male dominated world, even though her husband listened to her a lot and had a lot of respect for her, and she was given a fairly substantial role in the running of the empire. But it was all like on behalf of her husband, because no one else in the Holy Roman Empire held power on behalf of anyone else. It's not as if there was one emperor that everyone else theoretically derived their power and trust from. No, that's not how things worked. It was only Matilda. She was the only one in the Holy Roman Empire who had no power, um, or rather, held the power on behalf of somebody who outranked her. So eventually, Henry died. Matilda didn't have any children, so she opted to go back to Normandy, where Henry the First saw her as this strong figure who was had very high prestige because she had been the Empress, and she kept the title Empress for the rest of her life. So she held the highest noble designation possible because an emperor is higher than a king. And she also had experience dealing with foreign countries like France, Flanders, Germany. Note I use the term Germany and Holy Roman Empire interchangeably. I think it was called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. She had experience governing and all this other stuff. So her father married her to Geoffrey of Anjou, aka Geoffrey the Handsome, aka, if I could use a meme for a second, Geoffrey the Giga Chat. So at the time, Jeffrey, I think, was only 13, and Matilda was like 10 years older than him. But he was already known for just being a stone cold badass. And while their marriage was never happy, they were able to effectively work together. And they did have three children between the two of them. Geoffrey was, of course, the Count of Anjou, so he was a fairly important nobleman in his own right. Obviously, nothing compared to the King of England, but he had a pretty solid support base, and he had a lot of military experience because Anjou was constantly having border wars and rebellions and stuff like that. So he was very prestigious. He was known as a great warrior, a great general, just a very able dude, and him and Matilda had three children together. So the idea was that Henry didn't really have anyone else to inherit him. But like I said, Matilda had all this prestige. So he goes, you know what? I'll just make her my heir. Matilda's going to be my heir. She's going to be Queen of England after I die. And to that end, I'm going to get all the magnates, all the great lords of the realm to swear an oath that they would respect Matilda's rights, that she is my legitimate legal heir, and when I die, she will succeed me. And this included Stephen of Blois. It included pretty much everybody who would later snake on her and back Stephen for the throne. And once again, the narrative at this point is 100% poor Matilda. Poor Matilda. She was married to this like Chad, and she had gone from being emperor to being countess of a really wealthy county, and she had to have children, guys. She had to have three healthy children who would all one of which would grow up to be an even bigger Chad than his father. And all three of her children, as best as I can determine, loved her deeply and respected her for the entirety of her life. But you know how bad that is, guys? To have three healthy sons and have them listen to you. It's just that was the lot of a woman. Men never wanted sons. Men never wanted sons. Men never wanted to raise their sons. It was just a mess. She also shits all over Henry the First because Henry the First believed that if Matilda had been declared his heir and everyone had sworn sacred oaths to respect her right, that was enough. He didn't issue a will again before his death, reiterating the same thing that he had previously stated. And he only did that not because he thought the issue was settled, not because he thought he had more immediate affairs to deal with, but it was because she was a woman. If she had have been his son, he would have reissued it. That's like the blaming. Like Henry the First doesn't really get credit for picking a woman as his heir. It's his fault for not being clear enough when he said that she was his heir and said that he was going to make her his successor. But then he died, and poor Matilda, she was pregnant at the time. And she was unable to do anything. She was unable to go to London to get crowned. Although it really wouldn't have mattered because she wouldn't have gotten to London before Stephen, anyways. So immediately after Henry died, Stephen got the news first, and he immediately snaked on everybody, jumped on a transport, made it to London, grabbed the royal treasury, and had himself crowned. Now, the author says at this point, this had no precedent. This never happened in English history. People never usurped the throne in English history. If it had been a man, Stephen wouldn't have done this. It's not as though we have a recent example of someone being declared the heir of the current king and then some dude across the channel because he's at London gets himself crowned and declared the king of the English and usurps the position that was legally promised to the other guy. There's no reasoning. Oh wait, there was William the Conqueror, because William the Conqueror was allegedly made the heir of Edward the Confessor, but Harold Godwinson got the English lords to acclaim him the king of England. So William had to cross the channel, much like Matilda would have to do, and fight for his right. But she ignores this, even though there's a precedent of I mean, it's hard to get more masculine than William the Conqueror. That guy was an animal if you got in his way. So if people were willing to usurp William the Conqueror of all people because he was on the other side of the channel, I don't really see why it was necessarily because Matilda was a woman. Also, England didn't really have primogeniture. It was a very weird electoral system that was a mixture of different things. Sometimes they elected a king from the nobility. Sometimes it was just whoever could get to London first and get themselves crowned. Sometimes it was whoever was designated the king. Sometimes it was by right of conquest. Unlike France, it didn't have a very clear primogeniture system. And there was also a lot more importance placed on the coronation. In some systems, the coronation is kind of an afterthought, whereas once the king dies, the heir apparent immediately becomes king. But once again, all of this is just ignored. I don't think she even references any of this. She doesn't reference how like Anglo-Norman kingship works. She doesn't reference how the succession system works. She doesn't reference that there was precedent for this literally by the grandfather of both of the claimants to the throne. It's just solely because Matilda's a woman and she couldn't get there fast enough. And who knows if she wasn't pregnant, if she wouldn't have would have been able to get there fast enough anyways. Crossing the channel at this point in time was a very dangerous prospect. I believe it was Henry the First's sons had died crossing the English Channel. So Stephen might have gone across the channel and Matilda might have had to wait for weeks for the weather to be good enough anyways. But like I said, that was just kind of what happened. Now, what Stephen also did was he took the royal treasury and he just started using it to pay everybody off. Stephen was either a really nice guy or extremely weak, probably a mixture of the two, but he just basically said, I'll make everybody's dreams come true. He made irresponsible promises to the church. He paid exorbitant amounts of money. He started what would be the term, retracting or taking back titles that were controlled by his political enemies, and he gave them to his supporters. He just said, "You guys can get away with murder. Guys can do whatever you want, so long as you back me for the throne." And once again, the author says this, and then the next paragraph she goes, no, but it wasn't any of that. It wasn't that Stephen irresponsibly gave the realm's resources out to ensure his succession. It was just because Matilda was female. And it's like, you frequently will have in this book literally one paragraph that will say one thing that basically proves that there is a very logical reason for something, and then it'll immediately go poor Matilda. And this kind of brings us to another point. So all the chroniclers at this point in time pretty much agree that Matilda was a massive bitch. And because she had come from the German court, which was a lot more formal, and the position of monarch was a lot more sacrosanct and a lot higher profile. The English tended to be a lot more laid back about this sort of thing. They didn't have as sophisticated a court life. The king had, I guess, a bit more of a first among equals thing than maybe some of the other kingdoms, but she still behaved like she was the empress, that she was above everyone, and with a great deal of arrogance. So once again, the author says this is only because she's a woman. If she had have acted the same way and been a man, no one would have had an issue with this. There's no point in history where a ruler who's been an arrogant asshole has gotten rebellions to rise up against him, who's been overthrown, who's had trouble dealing with people because he was such an. Oh, wait, that also happened with William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was a massive asshole, and throughout his reign, the Anglo Saxon lords constantly rebelled against him because he was such a harsh and brutal man. So, once again, you have a counterexample to the narrative like two like two generations back. They're fighting over William the Conqueror's throne, but the author like can't be bothered to talk about William the Conqueror, how he ruled and what his legacy was. But Stephen's claim really made no sense because I forget if I mentioned this already. He couldn't argue that women couldn't inherit because he was matrilineally descended from William the Conqueror. So if he was going to say that inheritance can pass along the female line, his claim wouldn't work. Matilda was the closest living relative. So he couldn't say proximity of blood. There was really no claim whatsoever, other than he was like his the thing he came up with was I was acclaimed by the population of London. The population of London has the ability to elect the next king. Has that ever happened before? No, it's just something he literally made up. He made up this like insane thing that Matilda was illegitimate because her mother had been educated at a convent and she was actually a nun, and therefore the marriage was invalid and she couldn't inherit on those grounds, even though there was no evidence for that. And the church sided with Stephen because Stephen just gave them literally everything they wanted. Although the church were complete and total snakes in this instance, because when Stephen wasn't able to deliver on his promises, they switched sides and started backing Matilda. And then they would switch sides back and forth and back and forth. Once again, the churches during this time period never did that. They never sided with a particular king who gave them more over another. These things just like it was just Matilda. Once again, there's no precedent for this. None of this had ever happened before. Now, let's be honest. Was the fact that Matilda was a woman, did it play any impact in the succession crisis? I'm sure it did, but if you're going to say that, you kind of have to provide, I guess, more evidence than what they had. You also have to say why her context was different from all these other contexts, stuff that had happened in the same country less than like a generation or two ago. But like none of these things ever get addressed. One of the like more insane things she complains about is that a book called The Deeds of Stephen was biased against Matilda. She's like the Deeds of Stephen was biased against her because she was a woman. I'm like, no, it's because it was written by a partisan of Stephen. Like I don't partisans of a particular cause write all kinds of horrible shit about their opponents. They'll say they're gay. They'll say that they like had illegitimate children. They'll say that um for women they'll say they're prostitutes. They'll say all kinds of horrible shit. Why you're complaining that a smear piece that was written from a partisan of Stephen to serve as propaganda attacked her for being a woman is just retarded. Of course they're going to attack her for any reason they can. It's a fucking partisan piece. That would be like complaining that the propaganda the Allies put out during World War II wasn't fair to Hitler. It wasn't fair to Germany. It should have told the German side of it. Like that's not how these things work. It's a stupid point to even bring up. So yeah, so over the course of the Anarchy, very early on, Matilda's side managed to capture Stephen. However, Matilda made some bad military decisions, so her half brother got captured, and she had to trade Stephen for him. And her brother, half brother, had served her extremely loyally throughout his life, but she more or less says the author says, "Oh, he didn't actually care about her. He was just doing it purely for self-interest." Basically, everyone in the story other than Matilda acts out of self-interest. No one has any affection for each other. No one has any loyalty. Any of the people who serve Matilda, she basically says none of them believed in her cause. They all just did it because they wanted to get things out of her. And once again, this is, I don't think, how you write history. I think you have to have the assumption that people mean what they say they did. So if her supporters say they followed her because they believe she was the rightful queen, unless you can find really strong evidence to the contrary, like that Stephen burned them or Matilda was bribing them. And once again, there isn't these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can simultaneously believe in someone's cause, but also want to get paid for doing it. I mean, what's the old expression? Never do something for free that you could get paid to do. But yeah, she has to let Stephen go. She briefly takes London, but she's such a bitch that she gets driven out by the people of London in a riot. Eventually, and like during all of this, so she's over fighting this war in England. Geoffrey is fighting on the continent. And the book is extremely critical of him. She's like, oh, he abandoned his wife. He left Matilda to die. He didn't support her the way he should have. Although Geoffrey would ultimately win on the mainland, overrun Normandy and all of the continental possessions, which basically gave Matilda a base of support she could not be removed from because Stephen would never have the forces to invade the mainland. So Geoffrey basically completely won on his front. Matilda lost on her front, although she was able to hold on to a couple strongholds in England. And eventually she had to retreat to the mainland. But her losing in England was entirely Geoffrey's fault. If only he had have come across with all of his forces and not focused on fighting on a second front, they somehow it would have all worked out. There wouldn't have been any trouble ferrying the troops across the English channel. Like it's retarded. It's you can argue, and I think there's a fair point to be made that Geoffrey didn't really care about England because he was never going to become king of England. But both of them had a shared goal because both of them deeply loved their sons, even if they didn't particularly like one another. And both of them wanted their sons to inherit as much as possible. So towards the end of the war, um, Henry II became a very gregarious, active, charismatic, skilled warrior. He did some stupid stuff, like he led an invasion of England by himself, got his ass kicked, and then he had the balls to ask Stephen to give him money to get back across the English Channel. And Stephen, being the weakling he did, gave him the money to go back across the English Channel. Stephen could have won this war multiple times over, but he was just so generous. He was such a nice guy. He was so weak. He just would capture people and then they'd say they're sorry and he'd let them go. And then they'd snake on him again. And then he wouldn't like sack or burn things that he should have. And he was just incapable of winning a war he probably should have been able to win. But like I said, so Henry II was pretty popular, so Matilda changed her tactic to signing documents, Empress Matilda, mother of Henry, heir to England or something. And the author's like, oh, it's the worstest thing ever. Matilda's not going to be able to be a sovereign queen. She's going to have to sit her son on the throne. That's a failure in the eyes of the author. Getting your son to be king of England and Normandy is somehow like taking an L. I don't really get how that's taking an L at all because her dynasty would survive. But I guess that's a massive loss. What's kind of interesting is Geoffrey, once he finished taking over Normandy and he got the King of France to confirm him as the new Duke of Normandy, he immediately abdicated the position and transferred Normandy. I think Anjou and Maine also were transferred to Henry. So Matilda at this point, okay, no one really likes her, but her son is now the ruler of all the French territories. The King of France was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who ruled Aquitaine in her own right, as she was the last heir of her dynasty. So the King of France annulled his marriage to her because they hadn't produced any sons. So then Henry married her. So now Henry is the ruler of half of France, far more land than the French king ruled. And so he was in that position. Matilda still had some outposts on England. She had a very popular candidate, and Stephen was getting up there in years, and no one was sure how much longer he would live. So, to a lot of people, this would seem like a resounding success. She was in an okay position. Her son was in a great position. People loved him. People didn't like Stephen's son because he was an asshole. And things were looking pretty good for Matilda. So, what ultimately wound up happening was a deal was struck between Henry, Matilda, and Stephen that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but that his heir would be Henry II. And it was just like, this is the worstest thing ever. Matilda couldn't be queen in her own right. She had to settle for her son becoming king of an enlarged Angevin empire. It's a failure. Like, she's like, oh, this is a big L that Matilda took. Stephen died less than a year after the end of the Anarchy, and Henry II inherited all of it. And do you know what he did after he inherited it? Do you know what horrible thing he did to his mother? He made her regent of all the continental provinces while he went to England to rule there. But like, this is not a win for Matilda. Being in control of most of the Angevin Empire's population and wealth was actually a loss because she held it on behalf of her son. Her son who signed documents referencing her son who was very loyal and devoted to her and always sought her counsel. And when she died, he wept horribly and talked about how much he loved his mother. Like, what kind of a position is that to be in? It's just, it's so stupid. It's to anyone else during this time period in history, most people would see this as a massive win. Okay, she didn't win the war in terms of putting herself on the throne, but she was able to get a concession from Stephen that he didn't have to make. Stephen could have just prolonged the war further and maybe he would have been able to hold England. But she basically got Stephen to give up. He died immediately afterwards, anyways, and Henry II became king. And Henry II was one of the greatest kings that England ever had, although his sons were a dumpster fire. But we can talk about that some other time. And it's just like, it's just, there's so many levels that this book just fails. It fails in the fact that it doesn't like take precedence from within a couple decades of when this story takes place. It views things as a loss that no one else in human history would view as a loss. It says there's no way Matilda could have actually been a bitch. There's no way that anyone could have actually disliked her. It was all just 100% because she was a woman. Like, it doesn't even entertain any of these ideas. It just throws them out there. We don't learn anything about Matilda as a person. We don't learn anything about her as a ruler. It's just entirely people whining constantly. And it's a mess. And I don't know, like, I guess just because it's feminist, that's the reason why this got the reviews it did. And just to kind of end off with, I'm a partisan of Matilda. I think Stephen had no claim to the throne. I think I made that pretty clear. So I'm already on her side. I'm not reading this as someone who hates her. I'm not reading this as someone who doesn't support her side. I'm reading this as someone who is predisposed towards the position of the author, but she just fails at it. So those are my thoughts on the matter. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something, and I'll talk to you guys later.